Remember to turn on all notifications so you don't miss a video. This is the second part in my analysis of Araki's book on making manga, where I compare his narrative theory against my own. Chapter 3. Making compelling characters. Araki believes that compelling characters negate the need for story or setting. I slightly disagree. Great characters can carry more of the weight and lighten the burden on the other pillars, but it can't negate the need for them. Next, he says that a character's motivation is their most important feature. Nah, that would be their personality. Motivation is important, but he's sizing it. He says that a protagonist's motivation should gain interest and empathy from your audience. I'd say or rather than and, because I'm not completely empathetic with Light Yagami's motivation. Initially, he wants to fix the world, but then it turns into becoming a god. Speaking of this, here's a poor quote. What you would have to realize in the instance of shonen manga magazines is that those motivations will always be attuned with the reader's natural sense of ethics. End quote. He then lists friendship, effort, and victory as Jump's 3 principles. Well, Death Note's Light doesn't follow that and was still extremely successful. This is why you should avoid making rigid rules. He actually mentions Light here, but just says that characters like him, quote, require skillful technique for the mangaka to win over the readers, end quote. So is that just the exception to the rule? I disagree. Villainous characters can be entertaining as long as they're well written, just like heroic ones. And you know what a great feature for doing this is? Personality. I can easily get behind a villain if they have insane levels of charisma, regardless of what atrocities they commit. Next, he has an exercise for making motivations that I find pointless. You don't need writing exercises. It's not a sport or physical activity. Either you know what you're doing or you don't. Next, he talks about how the readers will empathize with brave characters. Shinji from Eva thinks otherwise. I think this is another pointless rigid rule. The audience doesn't always have to empathize with the character to like them. Sometimes cowardice can be respectable when it's executed as caution. Examples would be Krillin or Zenitsu. In another section, he talks about how readers can feel catharsis from an evil character that freely exhibits their desires in the way that the reader cannot. So what happened to empathy? Why create a strict rule just to make a major exception later? I do something similar with the concept of only break a rule if you're doing it intentionally, but this isn't that. It's not like he's saying you can write an unempathetic character to comment on something or experiment. This is a completely alternate path to success. Next, he says, contrast the hero and villain. I agree. It's preferred, but it's not always necessary. Watch my video on writing antagonists for more details. Next, quote, heroes fight alone, end quote. That's funny because all JoJos have a group or at least one ally. Here's a quote, and if there's one criterion for a hero, it's being alone, end quote. That's stupid. He's saying that the ultimate dilemma must be one that only the protagonist can solve. It's funny how he uses Vento Aureo's ending as an example, because it's the worst ending in his collection. And then Stone Ocean doesn't do that either. He talks about the appeal of standing alone against society's approval. I agree that this is brave and admirable, but that doesn't equate to being heroic. A character can stand alone against society as the villain. Does that make them heroic? No. His next section is about male and female characters. Dude said, quote, if anything sets apart male and female characters, it's only visual, end quote. That's a lie. In real life, there are personality and emotional differences between men and women, so acting like there's no difference is foolish. That doesn't mean that you can't write a masculine female and vice versa, because like in reality, there are exceptions, but they're called exceptions for a reason. That's back-to-back L's. Next is character histories. He says that he writes a history before the character. If this is a prescription, it's a bad one. You can technically start anywhere, but I prescribe that you start with their personality or role in the story. Histories can be helpful, but they aren't necessary. See How to Write a Good Character by your boy. Next is 60 facts to flesh out your character. In his image of what he plans out, he shows a bunch of useless stuff like blood type, illness, birth sign, type of voice, and many more. Unless these things directly impact the plot, you don't need to plan them. Unless there is a blood transfusion, you don't need blood type. Unless you keep track of the date and the ages of the characters matter, you don't need birthdays. Honestly, you don't even need age if it's not relevant to the plot. That's 3 legitimately bad tips back to back to back. Next, he talks about special moves and stands, but I don't think this is important enough to cover. I have a video on good power systems and good fights. Next, he says you can change characters if you don't like what you have. That's an obvious tip. Next, he says to use you and your friends as samples for your characters. I mean, you can, but I wouldn't recommend it. A, you have a limited amount of friends, which would limit the creativity for your characters. B, I think your characters should be built off of what your story needs. For example, your protag should follow the theme, your antagonist shouldn't. You might want a foil to juxtapose your protag. You might want a mentor figure, etc. I think basing characters off of already existing characters is much more helpful. Your friends might not fit the story you're trying to tell. Next, differentiating characters. His first tip is to use pop divinations like blood types, horoscopes, and more. I think this is stupid. A good tip he does have is don't have your characters overlap, although he's talking about blood types here. He also says that the supporting characters should provide contrast and chemistry with the protagonist. Completely agree. He later says that supporting characters are freer because it's okay to let them become disliked by the reader. I agree with the limits, but not necessarily his example. I think support characters are freer in the sense that they're allowed to go against the theme, or not even consider it. They can switch between hero and villain, but most protagonists aren't allowed to do this, especially if they start off the story on the side of the theme. I think a protagonist can become dislikable for a period of time, but for the most part, you want the audience to like your protagonist, so I kind of agree. Next, how to use supporting characters. He says, quote, "The principal way to handle supporting characters is to have them overcome their flaws," end quote. That's how most characters should be used though. Even if it wasn't, this advice is so basic. Next, he talks about names with rhythm, but this isn't important enough for me. Next, he recounts his process for introducing Jotaro. His next advice is, quote, "Strong characters are the key to serials," end quote. He brings up how Buso Poker wasn't serial worthy because of his protagonist. He says that the reason thrillers don't work is because they place emphasis on the plot and the characters tend to be weak. Such a hasty generalization. I'm sure Death Note and Promised Neverland, two manga from the same magazine, would disagree with him. Maybe Araki just forgot to write good characters in his thriller. He has a section about making money from manga, but the only useful piece of info is the amount he was making. He says that mangaka could earn 3,500 yen per page. This is basically $35. Next, he talks about how he based Cool Shock BT on Sherlock Holmes. He talks about what he learned from the cancellation based on the survey's increase towards the end. The first is that they introduced a strong antagonist who was a worthy opponent towards the end. The second is that the protagonist began fighting for his friends in the end. The worthy antagonist is definitely a good tip. You don't want fodder opponents, except maybe in the earliest phases. Fighting for your friends connects to Jump readers because that's what Jump values. I don't think this is universally good advice, but it is for his situation. That's the end of chapter 3. There's a blend of good and bad tips. The tips I disagree with are motivation, the exercises, empathizing, hero alone, male/female, history, 60 facts, and friend sampling. The ones I agree with are contrast, differentiating, and learning from your failures. The ones I feel are pointless tips or extremely obvious are special moves, changing characters, using supporting characters, and strong characters being the key to serials. That's 4 bad tips, 3 good tips, and 4 I don't care for. Once again, this book is not it, regardless of how good JoJo is. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and help me revolutionize the manga industry by buying my manga and spreading the word. All important links will be in the description.